Elden Ring is often revered as one of the greatest games ever made, and many consider it to be the best game ever made. But reaching such great heights comes with great expectations. So with the announcement of Elden Ring's DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, those expectations bloomed into enormous behemoth-sized monsters. But luckily for us, FromSoft just continues to go far above and beyond almost anything that we could have expected. So to say the least, Shadow of the Erdtree is pretty incredible. The landscapes look more grandiose, the bosses are more spectacular, and there's at least like 10 different poison swamps. So what more could you possibly want from a sequel of one of the greatest games ever made? Well, for starters, I really wish the combat in Elden Ring was a lot more fun. I had really high hopes that Shadow of the Erdtree would alleviate some of the problems that Elden Ring's boss fights have. Like, it would have been nice to see them pull back just a bit on the really extravagant and excessive attacks that many bosses will do. Instead, the DLC has left me pretty disappointed with the direction bosses have gone. Issues that were glaringly apparent from boss fights in Elden Ring were only doubled down on and pushed to their limits. So without a doubt, the combat experience in the Shadow Realm is some of the least fun I've ever had playing a Souls game. And no, it's not because it's too hard, but because it's just not fun. But before we delve too deep into my disdain for Elden Ring's combat, let's take a look at some of the upsides the Shadow Realm does have to offer, because despite my issues with its combat, Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree really is amazing. If this was a standalone game, it would easily be one of the best games FromSoft has ever released. Even if the combat has soured, the world and story have become exponentially sweeter. Elden Ring was already like having 2 or 3 Dark Souls games packed together as a single experience, and Shadow of the Erdtree simply adds a whole additional Dark Souls game on top of that. So the insane amount of new gadgets and gizmos, as well as bosses and areas to explore, makes it a whole new journey that lets you continue from where you left off in Elden Ring. At $40, it's probably one of the best deals in games as far as value goes. So if you love Souls games, FromSoft, or Elden Ring, you have to play this game. From here on out will be lots of spoilers, so if you haven't started playing Elden Ring or its DLC yet, I highly recommend that you do. Otherwise, get ready to hear more on what I like about the DLC, but mostly what I've come to hate about it. And when I say hate, I really mean it. Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree has one of the worst end bosses a FromSoft game has ever had. It's really that unfun. But we'll save talking about him in more detail for closer to the end. Anyways, continuing from here will mostly be a critique of my problems with the game, where I'll mention everything from level design to combat, but I wouldn't expect to hear too much about story. And because this is a game that's kind of well known for its difficulty, we'll also talk about that for a bit. And finally, I'll preface all of this with I'm not the best Souls-like player, although I have played every FromSoft Souls-like except for Demon's Souls. So I do feel pretty confident in what it means for something to be challenging and fun. And because of this experience, I also feel pretty confident as to why some people are finding the game too hard. But before all of that, let's take a quick look at my first jump into the Shadow Realm to get a better idea of what the DLC is like. Entering the DLC starts out with you in Mohg's palace, talking to Leda the Needle Knight, a recurring character of the new story. Leda will suggest to you to touch Miquella's hand, which will bring you into the Shadow Realm. Upon arriving, you'll be greeted by a set of stairs that funnels you into a famous FromSoft gorgeous view ahead scenery, and this view that gets burned into your eyes is no doubt absolutely gorgeous. It gives you a spectacular view of the Scadutree and some of its surrounding area. Somehow FromSoft levels up again in their visual design and do some of their best work to date in this game. It's stunning to look at, all while retaining that dark and grim style FromSoft has become so well known for. After gazing at the view for a bit, it didn't take too long before my eyes became fixated upon the monstrosity that is the fire furnace. And of course, my first thought was, that thing's gotta die. But after miserably failing to roll through its flames over and over again, I acknowledged that I was a bit stumped. I had no idea how to stagger him, and seeing that his health pool was beyond massive, I thought surely there's a trick to this, and I'll come back later. Looking back, I was surprised I did this, especially as one of those people who would gladly take on and fight the Tree Sentinel for hours before finally getting him. After strolling past this fiery bonfire of death, I see the first of many crossed moon glow sticks you'll come across in the Shadow Realm. These are crosses of Miquella, who is the main character of this story. Much of the DLC is about following in his footsteps and looking for these crosses that mark where he's left behind a part of himself on his journey to godhood. To be honest, I don't really understand this very well myself, but everyone in the game seems pretty concerned about the whole thing. Anyways, these crosses you'll find always have a grace and a Scadutree fragment. You'll probably want to collect as many of these fragments as you possibly can, since they're pretty necessary for using the new Scadutree Blessing system, which is kind of like the new level up system. Each Scadutree Blessing level up gives you far more power than you would ever get using souls at this point in the game. At this first cross is also where the game will give its poor and almost hidden explanation of how the Scadutree Blessing system works. It explains it about as clearly as you might expect a From Software game to do so, and doesn't do a great job of stating just how important this system will be to use. Surely that doesn't have anything to do with making the game feel much more difficult. Anyways, if you talk with the nearby caterpillar mask dude, the Hornsent, he'll give you a map that marks more of Nicholas' crosses to go visit. At the next cross just around the corner, you'll come across a couple more characters and the entrance to Bellyrat. The Bellyrat settlement is a really cool little dungeon town that's a bit reminiscent of earlier games. It has lots of nooks and crannies and tight hallways leading to open spaces. One of which will even lead to a poison swamp. Oh boy, running around and exploring this place made me feel like I was playing through Dark Souls 1 again for the first time, which is a rare but happy feeling to be sure. But this feeling simmered away pretty quickly, because it wasn't too long before I reached a fog door that was hiding my first boss encounter of the DLC. Going through this boss door lifted a veil that covered the much more vile parts of the Shadow Realm. The boss behind this door is the Divine Beast, and I absolutely hated fighting him during my first playthrough. I think having this boss being so close to the beginning of the game was also a pretty bad fumble by FromSoft. Anyways, fighting this boss with my measly level 1 Scadutree Blessing was an absolutely miserable experience. And after getting hit for like 80% of my HP over and over again is when even I thought, for a moment, a thought that had never crossed my mind in my hundreds and hundreds of hours of FromSoft games, that they might have made the game a little too hard. While thinking the game was a bit too difficult was my first impression, it isn't actually what the problem is. But before we get into that, let's first dive a bit more into what it means for a game to be difficult, and especially how it applies to a FromSoft game. FromSoft and difficulty go hand in hand, almost as much as complaining that a game is too hard while someone else shouts "get good" from the rooftops. But these complaints of the game is too hard mean something very different when it's coming from so many within the fanbase's most dedicated. These are complaints that are coming from people who have already beaten most of the original game and are now playing the DLC. These players aren't new to the game or genre. In fact, they've battled through some of the toughest parts of it, and yet they are still the ones saying that it's too hard. All of this kind of means you can't just tell someone like this, "get good," or "of course it's hard, what did you expect," and then ignore them. Again, this is a group of people who have already played through Elden Ring, and most of them must have expected a significant challenge. They've already seen and conquered the mini-bosses that will do a whole Olympic gymnastic routine that will fling them from one side of the arena to the other just to send out a beam of death that kills you in one hit. So despite playing through these kinds of bosses, they were still upset about the state of difficulty in the DLC. All of this just means we need to take a look at the situation much more carefully. Much more carefully than the typical "this is too hard" complaints we usually get from newcomers. The most common suggestions I see are things like "you just need to get over it and play the game correctly," or they say things like "you should get more Scadutree fragments to power up your character," use summons, or of course the classic and unhelpful "get good." Maybe the most confusing advice I've seen are the people suggesting that someone use a summon to a person who has already mentioned they don't want to use a summon. Anyways, those who are suggesting to get more Scadutree fragments are actually giving the correct advice. This is the main crux of the issue. The Scadutree fragments have totally altered the way in which FromSoft balances the game, and is a large part of why so many people are finding Elden Ring's DLC too hard. In truth, when the game is played as FromSoft expected people to play it, it's probably a much more balanced experience. Since if you first collect a bunch of Scadutree fragments and then fight bosses, the game is actually just about the same level of difficulty as you would normally encounter from other endgame Elden Ring bosses. So understanding just how much power the Scadutree Blessing gives and how the game is balanced around it makes it easy to understand why people are finding that the game is too hard. It's not like FromSoft was feeling extra sadistic this time around when creating bosses, but far more simply, it's a design issue of how Scadutree fragments are gathered more than anything else. And it's clear that FromSoft felt something was off themselves, considering how quickly they released a patch rebalancing the Scadutree Blessing. While this patch they put out is an improvement, it's more of a band-aid than an actual fix. The system really needed an overhaul altogether. So let's get a better idea of what the Scadutree Blessing does and how it plays into the balance of the DLC. Scadutree fragments are items that can be collected from exploring the Shadow Realm. They're scattered all over, but are typically gathered from similar methods. Whether you're picking them up near one of Nicholas' crosses, from a giant bowl, near an army camp, or you get it as a drop from hunting down a hungry hippo. And after collecting a few of these, you can use them to increase your Scadutree Blessing. Doing this will grant you power in the form of a flat % damage increase, but much more importantly, a similar % damage reduction from enemies. Really quickly, I'd like to show you what a huge difference these Scadutree Blessings will make in helping you survive. Here's with Dawn's very first attack with no blessings, and then with a level 5 blessing, with a level 10 blessing, a level 15 blessing, and finally a level 20 blessing. And for one final comparison, here's 0 blessing on the left and 20 on the right, just to show you the drastic difference in damage. So a damage increase might seem more important and enticing, but it's this damage reduction that creates the nightmarish balance scenario in Shadow of the Erdtree. This is just simply because taking 10 to 15% less damage can easily be the difference between life and death. This of course gives you a lot more room for errors like attempting to hit a boss while he's mid-swing or just trading HP. You'll simply have way more opportunities to heal and fight a little longer before getting sent back to the loading screen. This is just because the difference between having 0 levels in your Scadutree Blessing and having 5 levels is massive, and similarly between 5 and 10 and 10 and 15. After the patch, these early levels give you a ton of power, and past level 15 it can make the game feel too easy, unless you're fighting a certain someone anyways. But being level 15 plus Scadutree Blessing will make the game feel trivial compared to the early game. Fighting later bosses at this power level, like Ramana, will probably feel far easier than one of the more early boss fights, like the Divine Beast, Relna, or in some cases even the Golden Hippo. This creates a strange problem. Bosses you would likely expect to be much more difficult end up being a little too easy. A remedy to this might have been adding a slightly more linear progression to powering up, especially considering your character will have anywhere between 0 and 20 extra levels of power when fighting any given boss. FromSoft could have done something like give you a Scadutree Blessing level up from taking down Remembrance bosses, instead of just finding a fragment from some random hippo who ate one. Gaining power-ups from bosses was how this system was implemented in Sekiro, and it's just a lot cleaner. Not only because Sekiro is much more linear, but also because bosses are much more balanced around an expected power level of your character. So my point is that retrieving power from bosses would allow FromSoft to much more tightly tune the bosses to an appropriate expected power level. This would make it so bosses near the start of the DLC versus the end of the DLC to feel like the right amount of challenge. Because let's face it, I think most of the complaints about the DLC being too hard are likely from people who are below Scadutree Blessing level 5, and they're trying to fight bosses like Relna, Divine Beast, or if they're really unlucky, bosses like Bale or Mesmer. Although anyone fighting Radahn with a level 20 Scadutree Blessing and saying the game is still too hard is definitely totally right. But again, the point is that balancing most bosses would be a lot easier if they were instead tuned around getting power from them, since this would give FromSoft a much better expected power level range that players will be in. All that said, I imagine the reason FromSoft designed the game this way is so that players who are struggling can just go explore the world and power up like they were able to in the base game. Everyone who's played Elden Ring knows that taking down Margit for your first time is a lot easier if you just go explore a bit first. So maybe instead they could have given you power by splitting it up more where it comes from, something like giving you half of the fragments from bosses and the other half from exploration. This is much closer to how it works in the base game when you consider how drastic the rate of incoming souls increases after defeating bosses and going to new areas. This is implemented on a couple of bosses accidentally, where the Golden Hippo will give you 2 fragments and defeating Gaius will give you 5. But besides that, I believe nearly every fragment outside of Anir Elim, Gaius, and the Golden Hippo can be gathered before fighting a single boss. And the largest reason I believe that bosses should be more balanced around them giving you power versus exploration giving you power is because of how a large majority of players will likely play the game. There are 2 main ways I believe people traverse open world games. There are those who explore chaotically, and then those who explore an area with meticulous precision. For example, a more chaotic explorer might jump from area to area based solely on what they see, while a more meticulous explorer might be more likely to completely pick apart an area before moving on to the next. And I think the current Scadutree Blessing system is actually detrimental to both of these kinds of players. Those who meticulously explore might be more likely to face an early boss with little to no Scadutree Blessing levels if it's where they end up first. But of course, their verse could also end up being true if they decide to pick apart a few other places first that don't contain Remembrance bosses. This might leave them in a state of being overleveled for some bosses. But considering the layout of the DLC and how easy it is to end up in a dungeon with a boss, I think the former situation of being underleveled is much more likely. For more chaotic explorers such as myself, they are a little more likely to be fighting early bosses underleveled, especially if they're just going towards what they see and not completely picking it apart. And I say chaotic, but in a lot of ways I think it makes a lot of sense, since I think these kinds of explorers are more likely to be attracted to go towards bigger landmarks first, which will typically contain a Remembrance boss. So if these Scadutree fragments were instead designed to have more of them come from Remembrance bosses, players would be much more likely to be fighting bosses at a much more appropriate level. To go even further, I think they could have just not balanced the bosses near the first area around exploring it and gathering Scadutree blessings. Instead, they could have balanced them to be more in line with the other base game end bosses, because it's so unlikely you'll found a bunch of fragments by just exploring around the Graveside Plains before you run into any of the early bosses. I mean, maybe if you're lucky, you'll run into Relna or Divine Beast with a Scadutree Blessing of 3 or 4, but even then that's still going to place you into a very difficult and punishing fight earlier than you might like. While I've gone on about this for a while, I want to make sure I drive home the point is that this is only a huge problem early on. I think it's also really likely that this is where most of the complaints of the DLC's difficulty arise from. And funnily enough, I think the endgame has the complete opposite problem. If you end up exploring a lot of the map before fighting some of these more hidden remembrance bosses, the game is going to feel like a breeze. It might take you a long time to come across bosses like Metter, Midra, or Ramana, all of which, if you fought with a blessing of like 12 or higher, they're probably going to feel like a cakewalk, especially when compared to fighting Relina with even a level 3 or 4 blessing. And so what am I meant to do to get an appropriate challenge? Just not use the Scadutree Blessings? That doesn't seem like a great fix. At the end of the day, I really think the system needed much more testing on how players were exploring and traversing the DLC, as well as just how hard these early bosses were hitting them. But ultimately, this dilemma is caused by having an open world system where you can fight nearly any boss at any time. And trying to create a balanced experience in an open world game without any kind of level scaling is an incredibly difficult task. It doesn't help that using a system like level scaling has its own myriad of issues. Making a balanced open world game is a really tough problem, and sometimes it just feels like you have to live with a certain set of detriments if you want an open world game. Although I don't think this is an unsolvable problem, but if any game developer is going to figure it out, I don't think it's going to be FromSoft. I just don't think they value something like making sure the difficulty of the challenge is appropriate once you happen upon it, especially when it comes to an open world game like Elden Ring, because putting in too many roadblocks would de-incentivize players from exploring too much, which is kind of the main draw of Elden Ring. Although they certainly do put in some roadblocks like finding the Dectus medallions or taking down some bosses before getting to the Erdtree. Or for example, in the DLC they stop you from going into Stone Coffin Fissure before Miquella's seal breaks. But besides those few exceptions, I think the general philosophy is, why should I stop a player from finding General Radahn at the festival as their first boss, or Commander Gaius as their first boss in the Shadow Realm if that's where they ended up? I mean, I can think of a few reasons, especially from the perspective of someone doing that for the first time, but it seems likely that FromSoft highly values the individual having a unique experience in their game. Baldur's Gate 3 takes a similar approach where they add in these tiny little secrets and interactions that only a minuscule part of the player base might even see. This can translate to having really fun discussions with friends about how different your experience with the game was, and also adds a lot of replayability. So the thing that arises here is that FromSoft could put in more roadblocks to properly funnel you from boss to boss to make them feel like a more appropriate challenge, like they did in previous titles. But how detrimental is that to making sure that players are finding that they have a unique experience? This is the ultimate problem in Elden Ring's design when it comes to perceived difficulty of the game. But it's also a huge part of what makes it so good. There are so many unique ways to play the game, from build variety to which areas you decide to explore first. This makes the game amazing in many aspects, but it also creates a huge dent in how fun combat can be to experience, especially for someone playing for their very first time. By having such a vast array of choices in how you choose to play, it creates a huge spectrum of player strength, which leaves a lot of the resulting difficulty up to the player to decide how hard they want the game to be. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but just the result of creating an open world game with such a large variety of playstyles. I think maybe the fastest fix to this problem that would also be a really easy win for FromSoft would be including some sort of boss rush mode that you can access, where all the bosses are rebalanced and designed to be challenged at a very specific level and set of equipment to choose from to do it with. This would solve the issue of balance completely for a lot of players looking for an appropriate and fun challenge with the bosses. I think maybe the most frustrating thing about this idea is that it already exists in Sekiro, but they decide not to add it to Elden Ring for some reason. I think a lot of people would appreciate this kind of challenge existing in the game because the balance in Elden Ring is just so wacky, and finding the appropriate level of challenge is incredibly difficult. There's a pretty common misconception that if you do or don't use certain mechanics like summons, Scadutree fragments, leveling up, or whatever else, your experience will be much more difficult or much easier. But how difficult the game is going to be really isn't based upon these things at all, because the fact is the balance of everything breaks down completely if you know how to use everything at your disposal. Even at level 1 with no summons, you can beat the final boss in like 13 hits. We could sit here and talk for hours about all the different ways you can abuse the mechanics of Elden Ring to dish out crazy damage, or how a level 1 build can maybe do more damage than a normal player at level 170. But it's also kind of pointless, because not many people are going to be doing things like killing a DLC boss with a single spellcast, and very few people are going to be that guy that fights Elden Beasts at level 1 for 15 minutes while never getting hit. Instead, what we need to focus on is how a majority of players are going to be playing the game. But that's also kind of a problem because it's really hard to even know what something like that might look like, considering Elden Ring has such a vast arsenal to choose from. There's just a ridiculous amount of different ways to build a character and play the game, and balancing the game for someone who uses 5 buffs before going through the boss door versus the guy who just runs in dual-wielding size and using dragon incantations with 30 vigor while naked is just never going to be possible. So my point is that Elden Ring is just inherently unbalanced, and attempting to balance the game, or even talk as if it should be, is a fool's errand. While this isn't ideal in a vacuum of a game that only has combat, Elden Ring is a game that is much more than its combat. And it is also exactly this difference in potential power between two characters that is a part of what makes Elden Ring so amazing. I think it's actually pretty unlikely that Elden Ring would be as fun and meaningful if it were somehow totally balanced for every playstyle and build. It's an interesting kind of feat when you can design a game to have a super easy mode and at the same time have a subset of players that actually prefer to fight bosses with as little power as possible, or even restarting the run if they get hit. So it's not necessarily that FromSoft makes Elden Ring difficult, but instead it's the players that do. Elden Ring can be one of the most difficult games if played in one of these challenge modes, which only works because of how FromSoft designs their combat. There's not really anything to stop you from killing a boss like a DPS check or the boss having unavoidable damage, except for Moog. And everything is dependent on how well you avoid attacks and get your attacks in. But all of that doesn't make FromSoft immune from criticism. Just because a boss can be killed in 1 hit or 100 hits depending on how you choose to play doesn't mean that you'll be able to find an experience within that spectrum that is fun for you. And I do think that the balance of the bosses in the Shadow Realm, especially when it comes to the huge amount of incoming damage, feels really off when compared to the rest of Elden Ring. I'm also not a huge fan of these 10 to 12 second combos that have bosses flying through the air, being unhittable the entire time, and then they land and I can get like 1 to 2 swings in before they start a totally different Olympic gymnastics routine with a jetpack on. FromSoft has certainly hit a limit on how spectacular and powerful they can make bosses without the player feeling like they lose all of their fun. Don't get me wrong, these fights can still be enjoyable, but when I can only get an attack or two in like every 10 to 15 seconds, my patience begins to wane pretty quickly. FromSoft is sacrificing a lot of player interaction for bosses to fly around the room like Goku. I wouldn't mind if it was just a couple fights that felt like this, but in the DLC it starts to feel like nearly every fight is like this. The amount of interaction you get with most bosses just doesn't feel like it's enough. I have to say I think I had a lot more fun fighting bosses in Dark Souls 3 and early in Elden Ring. While this degradation in the quality of combat is in part due to the state of balance in Elden Ring, it's not the largest contributor. My largest frustrations with how combat has changed in Elden Ring comes from a feeling that there's now a lack of space. It just doesn't feel like there's enough time to actually play your character when you're not frantically dodging the bosses doing a front and backflip AoE bomb that has hitboxes to cover the entire arena. Bosses just have too many attacks that require you to play it perfectly in order to feel like you're allowed to play the game afterwards. While it can be satisfying to dodge a 15-second long combo, it gets exhausting to do it over and over again for little to no reward. I just don't know how to put it other than I don't feel like I'm getting to play the game as much as I was in previous games, especially when compared to something like Sekiro. And although Sekiro works quite differently where you mainly avoid damage by deflecting, the point is that deflecting almost always feels impactful. You're rewarded with the boss's stagger increasing from a deflection. You've just interacted with the boss in a way that feels much more meaningful than rolling. If they could have found a way to do something similar in Elden Ring, that would have likely made the game feel much better, like giving the boss a stamina bar or something. Instead, you can roll 4 attacks in a row and get hit by the very last one, or even the first one in a combo for your entire HP bar. And then your choice is to either heal it up or attack the boss and pray you don't get hit by the next one coming in exactly half a second. A game I think that actually did a really good job of adding interaction to Souls combat is Lies of P, and I 100% recommend playing that game if you feel at all similar to the way I do about the combat in Elden Ring. So again, the root of my problem with much of Elden Ring is that rolling just doesn't feel as rewarding, and the quick succession of attacks removes a lot of the player having different interactions with the boss. This lack of space also doesn't feel any better when so many boss attacks leave you with what is essentially 1 HP. But it didn't always feel this way. When you avoided damage perfectly in previous Souls games, you were usually rewarded with an opening to attack that wasn't only half a second long, and when you did get attacked, you didn't always feel pressured to heal or risk death otherwise. But these changes to how the game feels to play didn't come out of nowhere. They came about in Elden Ring because the developers have been in a series-long battle with the players. They've slowly been ramping the difficulty bit by bit to compensate for how much better the players have gotten over the past decade. This difficulty mostly comes from creating bosses that have smaller windows of opportunity to attack them, as well as making them much more unclear, while also increasing the amount of damage they do. That, and increasing the number of flasks you get and how much they heal you for by a ton compared to previous games, meaning bosses need to hit you for far more damage to account for your now incredibly large health pool. But the more fundamental problem that arises from Elden Ring's design is the lack of feeling of a back and forth between you and the boss. Instead, the boss is constantly pushing you back into a wall where you get to retaliate for a second every now and then. And then when the boss finally does push you into the wall, another artificial difficulty arises from the camera being out of whack This is partially just because the bosses are so big, and being unable to see what the hell is even happening is maybe one of the most frustrating ways to die in a Souls game. But beyond giving the players less space and a lack of vision, bosses also have a lot more change-up in their attacks, as well as just literally reading your inputs, which usually will be based upon your distance from the boss, or whether or not you're currently performing an action, or sometimes both, making it even more challenging to dictate your movements and also find the right time to attack. And the more you blur the line between a window of opportunity and a continuing attack chain, the more likely a player is going to just start trading with bosses, which is just less fun in my opinion. And of course, FromSoft has pretty heavily nerfed this method by vastly increasing the damage bosses do to you while keeping player HP relatively similar to previous games. All of this just means if you can't find an opportunity to attack as often as you would like, it's going to lead players to interacting with the boss far less often. And the less interaction you have, the less fun the gameplay is going to be. And on top of all of that, it will also likely lead players to becoming even more frustrated, which honestly might be exactly what FromSoft is going for, and everything I've just talked about was at least partially intentional. But either way, I would argue that these fights sacrificed far too much fun and interaction for the amount of added frustration. I do think there is a delicate balance somewhere between fun and frustration, but Elden Ring doesn't find it. Because of this, I started using a dagger in Elden Ring, all simply because I just wanted to hit the boss more often. I find that when I have more opportunities to actually fight back and counter the boss, the more fun I'm having. It gets pretty boring sitting around waiting for the boss to finish their hour-long combo in which they literally move the stars and fly through the air while slinging meteors. Yeah, these kind of attacks are a spectacle, which makes them fun to look at, but not nearly as fun to play around as they look, although I sincerely wish they were. Anyways, I figured if I used a dagger, I could probably press my attack button a little more often without getting totally blasted for it. To my surprise, this actually worked out pretty well, and was true for most of the base game of Elden Ring. And even though it's not the best damage, that wasn't really my concern. My only goal was to make the game more fun to play, which came down to me wanting to be able to dodge and smack bosses. Like I said, in the base game, this strategy held up pretty well for almost all of it. So I decided to bring this same approach to the DLC, thinking I might be able to find the same kind of fun, and then I found myself incredibly disappointed. One large reason for this is that bosses run away from you a lot, and again spend too much time flinging across your screen 20 years away from you. Or sometimes even worse, you just simply run the risk of bosses being able to do an attack with a faster startup than you, despite using one of the fastest weapon attacks in the game. It made it feel like FromSoft wasn't very interested in allowing my kind of playstyle to be fun or even viable in the DLC. I mean, of course, FromSoft didn't do this on purpose, but my playstyle just ended up as an unfortunate casualty by way of FromSoft pushing these boss designs to their absolute limit. And it's not like this was the case for every boss, just a lot of them. But it wasn't the case for only my daggers, but also when I even played as a spellcaster. I found that I would run into similar issues when fighting these bosses with the way they toss themselves around the arena like a ragdoll, that either spells simply just didn't hit as often, or I didn't even have the opportunity to spellcast as often. So my solution to this issue was just to use something else that I found fun enough when the dagger became too insufferable to keep using. So what else was there to do but find a much bigger knife? Although I definitely prefer to whittle things down with my baby butter knives, the great katanas ended up being pretty fun to use as well, especially the katana that has the dragon slash. The Dragon Slash ended up being really fun and cool to use, and is actually fast enough to get off in a lot of scenarios than most other Ashes of War. Which actually brings us to another really weird issue with Elden Ring's combat, Ashes of War. There's a ton of fun and really interesting weapon powers that exist within the base game and the DLC, but ultimately they can feel a bit useless. The lack of space in the game ends up meaning that you can hardly ever use these in meaningful ways. Bosses just typically don't give you a large enough window to safely use many Ashes of War. Or if they do, they'll be backstepping 20 feet away from you when you do decide to use it. And when you finally successfully land one of these Ashes of War on the boss, the damage was probably about as good as a jump attack. And then they're already back to hitting you with 2 ginormal swords and 10 pillars of light in succession. It's all a shame too, because there's a lot of weapons with really cool abilities, but they hardly ever feel worth using. And again, I think it's important to reiterate that the biggest reason this problem exists is a lack of space. And I don't know how to fix this. All I know is that the amount of interaction you're allowed to do with the boss feels incredibly limited due to the nature of how FromSoft has pushed bosses ever closer to their limits without completely boring the player to death from rolling too much. I mean, what's at the end of this line of design? A combo that lasts 10 minutes and has you rolling 100 times before you can even hit the boss once? Who's gonna play that game? Now that I've given a bit of my experience and perspective on boss combat in general, we'll soon get into looking at bosses much more closely and get a better idea of what I was talking about. But one more thing before we do that, let's understand what the ultimate goal of Elden Ring is, and really any game for that matter: having fun. Like I mentioned before, it's still fun and satisfying to overcome challenges in Elden Ring, it's just not nearly as fun as it was in other Souls games. I know I've repeated this a few times now, but it's what I really want people to take away. The reason this game isn't as fun is mostly because I don't feel like I'm playing the game as much as I was in other Souls-likes. It's just not as interactive, and the largest reason for this is simply because the game has you rolling too much. And when you're not rolling, the boss is too often not safe to attack or impossible to hit. It also doesn't help that avoiding damage by rolling is just nowhere near as interactive as doing something like a parry in Sekiro or Lies of P. And because a parry is more interactive, it works much better as something you have to do over and over again, unlike rolling. On top of that, with some kind of parry system, bosses being more extravagant isn't nearly as detrimental to the combat, since it feels like you can still make some kind of progress on taking down a boss without needing to hit them. Dodge rolling can be fun when I can use it to gain an advantage or get a hit out of it, but it's gone too far in the direction of incredibly tough execution for a very tiny reward. I think in FromSoft's next game, the combat will only thrive if they find a way to change up their formula. Something new has to be introduced to make the game more interactive, as well as feel rewarding to play in the moment, because in Elden Ring, the moment-to-moment combat is lacking a lot of luster. Right now, the best version of a Souls-like FromSoft has made is Sekiro. This is just my opinion, and for many of you, that spot might be overtaken by Bloodborne, which is fair, but if you have that opinion and have not yet played Sekiro, I would urge you to give it a go, it's really that good. The way the combat feels to play in that game is miles better than any other Souls-like for me. And the biggest reason why is what I've been advocating for this entire time. You're constantly interacting with the enemies in ways that feels rewarding and ultimately meaningful in that moment. The way it feels to parry an attack, swing your sword, and then have the ability to instantly deflect or dodge or react with a prosthetic arm ability feels unparalleled to any other game's combat. Not only does this game feel good to play, but nearly everything feels fair and far better because the game is very tightly balanced around a single weapon and toolset. This kind of design makes it so the developer knew exactly how strong your character would be for each boss. All of this simply means every boss in Sekiro will feel like it's the challenge that was intended for you to overcome, a feeling that is near often impossible to find in Elden Ring. Again, this kind of balance in Elden Ring is impossible and is also part of what can make Elden Ring fun, but what I really want to make clear is that it's not only a balance issue. It's way more of a how it feels to play issue. Sekiro feels much more consistent and has much more constant interaction with enemies, and the balance on top of that is just what makes it that much better. This is the same reason why I felt like playing Elden Ring with a dagger was so fun. It's as close as I could get to mimicking the kind of combat Sekiro gives you at all times. So, to be totally clear, my ultimate problem with Elden Ring's combat is simply that there isn't enough interaction between you and the enemy, and that just feels bad. Dodging doesn't feel as rewarding, there's not enough space, and you don't really even get to attack the boss that often. These will be the ideas to keep in mind while we take a closer look at different bosses. Before we really hone in on exactly what I hate about some of these DLC bosses, I'll first at least praise one of my favorite bosses to fight in Elden Ring. This may sound a little surprising to some, but I think one of the best bosses in Elden Ring is the Tree Sentinel, especially when playing with a weapon that has decent attack speed. He has very clear tells for his attacks, and it's incredibly noticeable when he has openings. On top of that, the amount of time you get for openings also feels pretty fair, and almost all of his attacks allow you to safely be the first one to strike when using something like a dagger. This boss just feels fun to fight, and the biggest reason for that is that it actually feels like there's a back and forth going on between you and the boss. But even the Tree Sentinel isn't perfect, and it's obvious from even this very first boss you might take on that the artificial difficulty has drastically increased from previous games. It's really telling when it can be found in the very foundation of the game's design, and what I might even consider to be one of the best bosses in the game. Because artificial difficulty isn't something that only occurs with things like camera movement and glitches. Things that can feel artificial can be as simple as the game not giving you a proper way to understand how to do something. Like avoiding damage from an attack. For example, there are many attacks in the game that are giant spheres that take up a large area like the Tree Sentinel Shield Slam. The problem here is that these kind of attacks are often giant and invisible. Although I say invisible, I don't mean this because you can't see the attack at all, but because it's impossible to tell where the hitbox of this attack starts and where it ends. It simply doesn't line up with whatever visual representation they're trying to give you. And to make matters even worse, invisible attacks like these tend to have multiple hitboxes. And so when you can't see an attack clearly, like how far it goes, when exactly it starts, or even how many times it happens, that's really horrible design. It becomes nearly impossible to avoid these kinds of attacks without doing a lot of guessing and random testing. And at that point, what am I even interacting with in the game? So the reason I call this kind of difficulty artificial is that it blurs the lines of what's reasonable for a player to figure out on their own. This is a huge issue that occurs far too often in the DLC. Requiring a player to guess how to dodge an attack isn't always bad, but it is bad in Elden Ring because it just happens so often. It's almost like a consistent theme that occurs over and over again. When there's no clear visual indication, puzzle, or some sort of riddle to solve on how to properly dodge an attack, the game gets really boring. Too many attacks just require you to see it multiple times and then guess and pray that it works. And that's the worst kind of artificial difficulty a game can have. Unfortunately, the DLC bosses push this kind of guesswork to even further extremes than the base game does. And because of this, your knowledge of what will damage you and why becomes far more inconsistent, making the artificial difficulty higher and higher, and the game more and more unfun. Even worse, if you do get hit after you've guessed how to dodge an attack incorrectly, you'll get hit for nearly your entire HP bar a lot of the time. And then you're forced to interact with the boss even less and look for an opportunity to heal. Even the very first boss I fought, the Divine Beast, made me feel like this. Before I complain about how annoying this boss can be to figure out, I will say that this is a really cool fight in the visual department. It's got a lot of flair and some pretty wicked moves. And the attack where the Divine Beast changes between all its forms, using an attack from each, is pretty cool. But one of the first artificial difficulties that does arise from this fight is that it's tough to tell if you're even intended to fight him this early on or not. Especially since this area leads you towards the final boss if you've done everything else. But you also don't even need to go through here at all to get to the final boss, so I don't know, it all just feels really confusing. It's just another issue with the blessing system and trying to properly tune bosses for an open world experience. While the Divine Beast attacks look really cool, they're also incredibly difficult to understand and how to properly avoid them. Which, of course, brings us back to the artificial difficulty of guesswork. It doesn't feel like I'm doing anything smart or interesting, I'm literally just guessing until I get it right a lot of the time. Something that furthers this problem and makes him really annoying to attack is that it's tough to tell whether or not he's in a resting position. Typically this is a pretty crucial sign when fighting against any Souls-like boss. It's a kind of sign that says, yeah, I'm finally done flailing about and this is your chance to hit me. Another very frustrating thing about these attacks is that they are constantly pushing you, forcing you back into a wall, which will make the camera go wacko mode, making it impossible to see, and dying in frustration to another artificial barrier. I really don't understand why they can't just zoom out the camera a bit for situations like these, or add some transparency to the wall. This is especially annoying if you consider that they already have the technology, since they do zoom out the camera for a portion of this fight when he goes up into the air to do his special move. So why can't we get that angle like all the time? On top of this, the Divine Beast is also horrible to fight using a shorter weapon. He'll constantly be backing away from you, and he has a small hitbox, and trying to hit him from the side means you can't see what the hell he's doing. This boss also has combos that feel like they last forever, like when he rushes towards you, bangs his head into the ground only to lift himself up and spray an element all over the floor for another 7 seconds before you can get a single hit in. And then he starts his next attack almost immediately after. All in all, this is a tough boss on its own, but on top of that difficulty, there's also a lot of annoying artificial difficulty that just makes it much more unfun to play against. Simply, this boss has a cool design, but it gives you nearly no space, room for interaction, and requires a lot of guesswork to properly learn how to dodge its attacks. And sadly, this doesn't end at this boss, so I'll give you a few more examples of what I mean. Midra is probably one of the best bosses in this DLC, and is maybe the only boss where the artificial difficulty is tuned down to the minimum, like the Tree Sentinel. He has clear windows of opportunity with space, and it's pretty easy to tell when he goes into resting position. Most of his attacks are things that you've already kind of learned how to deal with before, like if someone is smashing their weapon into the ground, you've probably learned that that's not the end of it. On top of that, his newer stuff like his crazy AoE madness attack actually feels pretty dodgeable and intuitive to do so. Except for one, which is the big AoE madness bomb he throws when he phases. This attack is not too dissimilar from the Tree Sentinel Shield Slam attack and its problems. But even worse, this attack has 2 hitboxes for some reason, and you kind of just have to hope you run far away enough from it to not get hit. But of course, whether you're far away enough or not is just a total guess. Another pretty good boss is Bale. His attacks are mostly reasonable to figure out how to avoid, but he has some attacks that are just impossible to understand how to dodge without guessing. Like that one attack where he jumps into the sky, shoots laser fire towards you in 2 different directions, and they happen to look as if they take up the entire arena. Or the attack where he's dive bombing you and his hitbox is suddenly the size of 2 of him for some reason. Most of this badness happens in phase 2, but it can make that part of the fight feel miserable. And it also doesn't help that sometimes it just feels like his attack chains go on forever and ever before you can finally feel safe to attack, just like every other DLC boss. Gaius is probably one of the most famous of the DLC for his confusing hitboxes, the main one being his charge, which can feel near impossible to dodge at times. And the hitbox for it is active for a really long time, so if you're truly unlucky, you can actually get hit twice and instantly die. On top of this, he seems to be invulnerable during it or something, because most attacks and spells will just go straight through him while he's charging. But honestly, if this charge attack didn't exist on Gaius, he probably really wouldn't be that annoying to fight. But this attack has so much artificial difficulty attached to it that it alone makes the entire fight really annoying. Now I won't go through every example, but these are just a few that exemplify some of the worst artificial difficulty you might come across in the Shadow Realm. But the actual worst has yet to come, and as you might have figured out already, it's time to talk about the final boss, Promised Consort Radahn. First off, I'll say that the visual design of this fight is beyond spectacular, and unfortunately that's about all the good things I have to say about this fight. I can't stress enough that this was one of the most unfun Souls fight experiences I have ever gone through, especially the first time around where it feels near impossible to figure out what the hell is even happening. The artificial difficulty of this fight is amplified to the highest levels of absurdity, and it's so bad that I thought this fight must be bugged, unintended, or a joke. Reeling us back in a bit, the base moveset in Phase 1 really isn't too hard to learn or play against. But it's also not very fun to play around, since you're just forced to only roll, parry, or block each of his chain attacks without retaliation until he's finished swinging 100 times. And one of the few attacks that he has that only lasts 3 swings is actually one of the most difficult attacks to roll in the entire game. This attack has an extremely fast startup with his left hand, and is only rollable if you start to roll immediately and you're on his right side. Otherwise, you will get hit by some part of this attack every single time, unless you use some other option to avoid it, like blocking it or parrying it. Despite some of these options being available and making it easier to avoid, none of these options are available to you within the baseline toolkit of your character, so without them it's maybe one of the most unreasonable attacks to learn how to properly dodge. I think almost every move in this game is pretty reasonable to learn how to dodge, even if sometimes they take a bit of guesswork. But this move, and many more of them in this fight, go far beyond the unreasonable. Of course, once you do learn how to properly dodge these attacks, like anything else, it's usually not that difficult to execute. Except for this 3 swing attack. This one stays tough to do the entire fight because he can do it nearly any time, and your ability to dodge it is highly dependent on your position relative to the boss. Not to mention, it has an extremely fast startup. It is the most unreasonable move to dodge with the baseline toolkit, even above Melania's Waterfowl Dance, although that attack is far more punishing if you do get hit by it. To give a little more perspective on the ridiculous difficulty of how to dodge this attack, I only successfully rolled it twice before I finally beat him my first time. And both times were a total accident. I had no idea how to replicate what I was doing. And that's never happened to me before in a Souls fight. And I fought him for nearly 5 hours in total before taking him down my first time. I did eventually successfully dodge his attack on purpose on my next character, but it was only because I saw someone else figure out how to do it. It's simply just all random guesswork, which again is among some of the worst kind of artificial difficulty to have in your game. So the main takeaway here is that while there are of course many ways this attack can be avoided, it doesn't change how ridiculous it is to try to roll it. Although I will say I'm not against this kind of thing existing. I don't have a problem with the concept that you can't just roll everything to avoid the damage, but the game has to be built around that idea, and Elden Ring is absolutely not designed with that intention. One of the primary foundations of these From Souls-like series is that nearly every attack, probably 99% of them, can be reasonably avoided with the base moveset given to you. And because of that, players will expect to be able to do so. So suddenly throwing in a move that feels nearly undodgeable like this, unless you know the very specific set of conditions required to dodge it, simply doesn't feel good. It makes it feel as if the foundations and expectations that From has built up have started to crumble with this fight. All that being said, having a game where you are forced to think about using all the tools in your disposal in order to properly dodge a boss and get hits in could be a really fun way to play. But Elden Ring is simply not designed in that way. I would love to see a FromSoft game where this is the case, but this might not have been the time to experiment with that just quite yet. The rest of Radahn's problems start to arise in the second phase where things only get worse. Miquella will decide to take a wild piggyback ride and starts to add light pillars to every swing Radahn performs. Even throughout the madness of this second phase, my least favorite attack, and the one that killed me the most often, remains that 3 swing attack that feels nearly impossible to dodge, but a close second is his gravity attack that pulls you into melee range with him. It's not so much that this move is difficult to avoid or dodge, but the mechanics of how it can work even when you do avoid it. If you roll his pull but stay within melee range of him, he can still do his follow-up that is incredibly difficult to avoid, and then in phase 2 he does an extreme version of this that might as well just be death. Dodging into Radahn when he does his move in phase 2 and getting hit by the follow-up has to be one of the worst feelings I've experienced while playing a Souls-like, simply because it feels as if I did avoid the attack but still got punished for doing so. The fact that he can even do this attack while I'm already in melee range with him is just pretty dumb. Another aspect of this fight that makes this move so especially egregious is that Radahn is basically begging you to dodge forward on every one of his attacks except for this one. Another attack that somehow becomes even worse during phase 2 is his meteor attack. In in-game boss fashion, he'll fly around in the air for upwards of 20 seconds doing some unpunishable bullshit that you can only run from. But again, what makes this fight even worse than even that is simply the visual clarity is at the bottom of the barrel. And the reason why is just how this boss functions. In Phase 2, after each swing of Erdan's swords, he'll leave behind pillars of light that will deal damage to you. All of these must be dodged because they'll likely stagger you for long enough to get hit by his next swing, and getting hit twice likely means you're dead. And so the best way to stay out of the way of these requires you to constantly be circling towards the backside of Erdan. This wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for Miquella's hair completely blocking your view of what attack Erdan is going to do next. If you're somehow able to see past Miquella's hair, there's even another visual obstacle of pillars of light blinding your vision. So you have to get behind Erdan to avoid this attack, but everything is so bright, ridiculous, large, and blinding that you can't see what you're even supposed to be avoiding. So I hope you've memorized his entire base moveset, as well as the one Pontiff combo from 8 years ago that he only does during Phase 2. And then there's this multi-light clone attack that I found out wasn't a bug, and it's how he functions for everyone else, and it made me incredibly confused. Like, how in the world are some of these meant to be properly dodged? Like I keep mentioning, there's the artificial difficulty that obscures you from what the boss is doing, and also the kind that has you guessing at how to dodge something so visually unclear. And this fight throws both of these at you layered on top of each other over and over again. Being behind Erdan plus Miquella while watching out for Erdan's next attack through Miquella's hair and trying to dodge the insane amount of light beams coming out of nowhere while your game is permanently dropping frames is just a total nightmare. So yeah, this fight is pretty bad. All things considered, Promised Consort Erdan is very unfortunately some of the worst design I've ever seen FromSoft do. But boy, at least he looks cool, I guess. I've been ranting for a bit about combat and how much I did not like the direction FromSoft has gone with it. And while combat and bosses are important in Elden Ring, they are not what make or break the game. The main experience I'm looking for when I play nearly any game is for the game as a whole. So let's take a break from talking about the nuances of combat and talk about something that most will likely agree on, that the world design of the Shadow Realm is fantastic. While the level design of Elden Ring's base game is top-notch, FromSoft somehow find a way to go above and beyond that with the Shadow Realm. Although I do think I could have used a little extra help in the map department. Given just how vertical and layered this world is, it makes looking at the map a ridiculous headache. It would have been pretty helpful to have some kind of layers you can show or hide to more easily understand where you are on the map. And what's really weird about that is that they've also already solved this problem with the base game and the underground, which makes me wonder why they didn't do something similar here. But maybe they just couldn't think of a good way to split it up and gave up that, who knows. One other really strange thing is that after you defeat that menace of a dancing lion dragon thing in the Belly Rat settlement, you'll unlock a set of stairs that will lead you into the game's final area, near a limb. Most likely you'll get here before burning the Scadutree roots surrounding it, so you'll be blocked off from going in. This probably makes most people think, oh, I've got to find a way to unblock this so I can come back later. But no, you don't ever have to come back here. In fact, you don't even need to defeat the Divine Beast in order to get into near a limb. After you burn the tree and remove the shadow roots surrounding the final area, the game just teleports you inside instead of making you go up the stairs for some reason. I can't really think of a good reason why they would do this, and it also just makes it a lot less satisfying to enter the final area. If this was their intention all along, why not just make the Belly Rat settlement a part of the ruins somehow? Or make it so the only entrance to get into Belly Rat Tower is from the ruins rather than the cross near the beginning of the game. This solves a lot of issues. One, it puts what I think is one of the much more difficult bosses in a much more appropriate place for him to be challenged, where you'll likely have a lot more fragments to deal with him as well. They could probably even rebalance him or buff him a little bit to compensate for this new position. This also helps solve the whole issue of teleporting you straight into near a limb. But they don't really even need to do all of that. In fact, it was really surprising that they would even opt to teleport you into the final area. FromSoft is very well known for basically doing no handholding throughout all of their games, so why is it different here all of a sudden? Does FromSoft really think we would have never found the entrance in Belly Rat? This is especially strange when you consider the route you need to take in order to get to Midra. First, you need to find this corridor that's behind a waterfall and tucked away in the corner of the enormous Shadow Keep. And next, you'll need to uncover that there's actually an invisible wall here, then jump in the coffin that's back there. This will essentially bring you to an entirely new area, and eventually you'll find a catacomb at the end of it. And then after finally getting through this giant catacomb, you must then search a giant and nearly empty forest that mostly contains terrifying madness zombies just to discover a single hidden mansion. And this is the only route that leads to Midra. There's no other way there. So yeah, I just don't understand the desire or need to teleport the player into the final area when you consider how the rest of the game plays. And even more so when you've already made it very clear where that place you need to go is. But besides these weird nitpicks and hiccups, the level design and visual work of the DLC remains some of the best FromSoft has ever graced us with. The use of colors, the views, scenery, characters, the secrets, and the lore behind everything just feels absolutely pristine and top-notch. This is the Miyazaki stew working as intended, and it's amazing to see what's coming out of it. Just look at the amazing variety you can get from just walking for about 2 or 3 minutes. You can walk across an ashen corpse of an absolutely enormous dragon god into a field of stunning red flowers only to jump off a cliff into a cool field of blue. It might not even be totally bizarre that you would find yourself soon on a coastline walking towards a ruins of old fingers. It's wild how they can seamlessly smash all of these different places together into a cohesive area that all has significance in the story and lore. The Shadow Realm is beautiful to traverse, but it's also incredibly confusing and easy to get lost or have no idea how to reach a certain area. You can easily see that you can probably get there, so in true FromSoft fashion, both are hidden behind some sort of vague mystery. One being a secret that requires you to use an emote at a statue with like 2 minuscule hints, and the other is that previously mentioned illusory wall in a room tucked away behind a stream of water in a random corner of the Shadow Keep that leads you to a coffin that you have to take. I hate this, and I love this. It's so FromSoft. These things would be amazing to discover on my own, but I searched for hours and hours for both, and I just ultimately gave up and looked them up online. I don't know what the fix for this is, or even if it needs to be fixed. Maybe if there was just like one more vague hint laying around somewhere, it'd make it a little easier. But this is also just kind of how FromSoft rolls, expecting you to figure out big secrets with as little information as a single sentence or less. Luckily, playing online can help out a lot with these, and following other players' messages can lead you to them. Or just into the abyss. It's usually the abyss or hitting a wall for no reason. You can't really trust a lot of these a lot of the time, especially since half of them are lying and the other half are butt and edging jokes. But every now and then they're actually right, and that's pretty fun. As far as the dungeon-like areas that you'll end up at, these are, as usual, incredibly fun to traverse and run around. The storehouse, for example, was amazing. I couldn't believe there was more and more to it. And then you find out you can explore the exterior of it. And then beyond that, you learn there's an entire church district behind it that can only be accessed by going to the complete other side of the map, which allows you to go to the very top of the storehouse, leading to even more to explore with various secrets to uncover. With one of these secrets, of course, leading you to an elevator that takes you all the way down to the ground level near the Scadutree and facing off against an overgrown sunflower. FromSoft loves all these long-ass elevator rides, and I do too. They really give an amazing sense of depth that the game world has. But this isn't even the best part. At some point after reaching the pig riding menace, there's a secret close to him that we've already talked about that was my absolute favorite moment playing the DLC. Not only because you get to fight 2 tree sentinels, but you also discover Marika's home, the Shaman Village. Walking around while the main theme of the game played and learning the lore behind this place left me in awe. The game has told us so much about the lore of the world and why everything happened, and we finally ended up at the place where the story began, and it's just so cool. Other notable great moments include things like jumping down a big hole in a peninsula to get to the Stone Coffin Fissure. Battling my way across the demon ball lasers was frustrating but super fun, and this also made me feel as if I was playing Dark Souls again for the first time. Struggling to actually traverse an area was a treat to experience again. And then getting through this entire gauntlet only to jump down into another enormous hole to find a wacky flailing skeleton horseman. Just every dungeon feels like a totally unique experience. Every area had me excited to uncover what's there and find what's at the end of it. Not even the dungeons and areas themselves, but even just the boss arenas look amazing. So despite the combat being pushed to its limits and creating a much more boring experience than FromSoft probably intended, I still think it's one of the best games ever made, just because of everything else. The lore, the world, the amount of build variety there is, and ways to play the game are fairly unmatched in quality. And especially considering the game's combat is still probably pretty fun with some other playstyles. Unfortunately, I just don't find those playstyles nearly as interactive or interesting to play. So here's to hoping that FromSoft continues to evolve the combat of the series into something a little more fun to interact with. There's probably not a ton of you, but for those of you who have been waiting around for another video, thanks for being patient, and I really appreciate that you continue to watch. It's nice knowing that there's at least some people out there who want to hear me yap about games. I've been trying to hammer down exactly the kind of writing I want to do, and I think I'm close to it. I've been working on a few different things, so hopefully there's more coming in the future a little sooner than usual. Although I'm not totally sure what will be next, I'm definitely going to play Black Myth Wukong, so be on the lookout for that. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. And anyone still here for whatever reason, my actual favorite boss is not the Tree Sentinel, but Godfrey and Horlu. I couldn't really find a good way to fit these into what I was talking about, but this boss is just amazing, so thanks FromSoft.